You know the image. A hairy, hunched over figure, lowbrow, big jaw. He's holding a club. He maybe has a woman by the hair. He grunts. He lives in a dirty cave, gnawing on a bone. This is the caveman, the brutish, stupid, savage ancestor we supposedly crawled away from on our long march to civilization. This image is everywhere. It's in cartoons, movies, and jokes. It's a simple, powerful idea. And it's almost completely wrong. The story of the Brutish Caveman isn't really a story about our ancestors. It's a story about us. It's about the people who first found the bones and what they wanted to believe about themselves. It tells us more about the prejudices of the 19th and 20th centuries than it does about life in the Ice Age. The evidence we have now paints a very different picture. A picture of a complex, adaptable, and surprisingly familiar kind of human. To understand why the stereotype is a lie, we first have to understand how it was born. It all started in 1856. In the Neanderthal Valley in Germany, workers at a quarry found a strange-looking skull cap and some bones. They thought it might be a bear. A local teacher, Johann Fulrat, realized it was something different. It was human-like, but not quite human. The skull was long and low, with a thick brow ridge. This was the first recognized fossil of what we now call a Neanderthal. At the time, this was a huge shock. Darwin's On the Origin of Species wasn't even published yet. The idea that humans had ancient, extinct relatives was radical. Many scientists were skeptical. Some said it was just a modern human with a disease, maybe a Cossack soldier from the Napoleonic Wars who had crawled into the cave to die. But as more similar fossils turned up across Europe, the reality began to sink in. There was another kind of human before us. The real damage to the Neanderthals' reputation came from one man. His name was Marcellin Boulay. He was a prominent French paleontologist. In 1908, a nearly complete Neanderthal skeleton was found in a cave at La Chapelle aux Saints in France. Boulay got the job of studying and reconstructing it, and he saw exactly what he expected to see. He saw a brute. The skeleton from La Chapelle was an old man. We know now he had severe arthritis in his spine, which made him stooped. He had a broken rib that had healed. He was missing most of his teeth. He was, in short, a mess. But Boulay didn't see an old man who had lived a long, hard life. He saw a species defined by its infirmities. He reconstructed the Neanderthal as a slouching, bent-kneed ape man with a divergent big toe, like a chimp's, which would have made walking upright clumsy. He said their brains were simple, and they were incapable of complex thought. Basically drew the cartoon caveman. This image stuck. Why? Because it fit the story people wanted to hear. The Victorian and early 20th century Europe saw itself as the peak of creation. They had empires, industry, and science. The idea of progress was everything. To them, history was a straight line and arrow moving from primitive to perfect. And they, of course, were the perfect. The Neanderthal was the perfect other. The savage they had overcome, he was the primitive past, and they were the civilized future. Boulay's reconstruction wasn't just science, it was a cultural statement. It confirmed their sense of superiority. Pop culture ran with it. H.G. Wells wrote about the brute men. Movies like 1,000,000 Years BC. Cartoons like the Flintstones solidified the image of a simple, club-wielding suburbanite in a prehistoric setting. The Brutish Caveman became a joke, a simple shorthand for anything primitive or unintelligent. The lie was complete, but science didn't stop. Over the next century, our methods got better. We found more bones, we developed new ways to analyze them, we learned how to date things more accurately. And with every new discovery, the picture Boole painted started to crack. The hunched-over brute was replaced by something far more interesting. Something far more human. Let's start with the basics. The brain. The stereotype says cavemen were stupid. But Neanderthal brains were, on average, slightly larger than our own modern human brains. Now, size isn't everything. Brain organization matters more. Their skulls were shaped differently. Ours are high and rounded, like a soccer ball. Theirs were long and low, like a football. This suggests their brains might have been wired a bit differently. Some scientists think they may have dedicated more brain space to vision and body control, which would have been useful for hunting large animals in a dim Ice Age Europe. We might have dedicated more to social networking and abstract thought, but different doesn't mean dumber. It just means different. To survive for hundreds of thousands of years in a harsh, changing climate, you have to be smart. You have to be adaptable. You can't be an idiot. And their technology shows they were anything but. The classic image gives the caveman a crude club or a pointy rock. The reality is something called the Mousterian tool industry. This wasn't just about banging two rocks together. Neanderthals were master flint knappers. They could visualize a tool inside a core of stone before they even started. They developed a sophisticated technique called the Levallois method. This involves carefully preparing a stone core, shaping it from all sides, and then striking it just right to pop off a finished tool, a flake with a sharp, ready-to-use edge. It's a multi-step process that requires planning, precision, and a deep understanding of the material. It's a skill you have to teach and learn. It's not something you stumble upon by accident. They made different tools for different jobs. Sharp points for spears, scrapers for preparing animal hides, or knives for butchering meat. And they didn't just use stone, they used bone, wood, and shells. One of the most amazing discoveries was evidence that Neanderthals made birch bark tar. This was humanity's first synthetic material. You have to heat birch bark in an oxygen-free environment to a very specific temperature. Too low and nothing happens. Too high and it burns to ash. The result is a sticky black glue. They use this tar to attach stone points to wooden shafts to make spears. This is a complex chemical process. It shows a level of ingenuity and planning that is completely at odds with the brutish stereotype. They were problem solvers, they were engineers. What about their lives? The cartoon caveman is a lone savage or lives in a chaotic, violent group. But the evidence suggests a deep capacity for social bonding and even compassion. Let's go back to that old man from La Chapelle aux Saints, the one Buller used to create the brutish image. He was old, he had crippling arthritis, he had lost almost all his teeth. How did he survive? He couldn't have hunted effectively, he couldn't have chewed tough meat. The only way he could have lived to such an old age in that condition is if someone was taking care of him. Someone in his group was protecting him, bringing him food, and maybe even chewing it for him. This is not the behavior of a mindless brute, this is empathy, this is compassion. And he's not the only one. There's another famous fossil from the Shanidar Cave in Iraq. It's an individual known as Shanidar I. He lived to be around 40, which was a ripe old age back then. His skeleton tells the story of a brutal life. He had a crushing blow to the side of his head when he was young that would have likely blinded him in one eye and possibly damaged his brain. His right arm was withered and had been amputated or broken off above the elbow. He walked with a limp because of a badly healed foot fracture. He was, by all measures, severely disabled. Yet he lived for decades after his injuries. His group didn't abandon him, they cared for him. They supported him. These fossils are silent testaments to a society that looked after its most vulnerable members. They had a social safety net. They also had a sense of culture of a world beyond just survival. For a long time, it was thought that art and symbolism were unique to our species, Homo sapiens. But that wall is crumbling. We now know that Neanderthals deliberately buried their dead. Finding skeletons in pits, carefully positioned, is not the same as finding bones scattered where an animal died. It implies a ritual. It implies respect for the deceased. It suggests they had some concept of life, death, and maybe what comes after. At the same Shanidar cave, pollen samples found around one skeleton led to the idea of a flower burial, that the body had been laid to rest on a bed of flowers. While this specific interpretation is now debated, the pollen could have been brought in by rodents. The evidence for intentional burial across many sites is strong. They also created art, or at least personal adornments. At sites in Croatia, archaeologists found a set of eagle talons that had been cut and polished. They were likely worn as a necklace or a pendant. This isn't for survival, this is for show. This is identity, this is symbolic. They found shells with holes drilled in them, covered in ochre, a red mineral pigment. They were using color, they were decorating themselves. Ochre has been found at many Neanderthal sites. They might have used it for body paint, for decorating skins, or for rituals. It shows they thought in abstract terms. The most stunning discovery came from caves in Spain. Where deep inside, there are paintings on the walls, red lines, dots, and the stencil of a hand. For years, everyone assumed modern humans made them, but recently, new dating techniques were used on the thin layer of calcite that had formed over the paint. The results were shocking. The paintings were over 64,000 years old. That's a full 20,000 years before Homo sapiens are thought to have arrived in that region. The artists could only have been Neanderthals. They were venturing into the dark, deep parts of the earth with torches and painting symbols on the walls. This is one of the most fundamentally human things we can imagine. And what about language? The caveman grunt is perhaps the most enduring part of the stereotype, but the physical evidence suggests they were perfectly capable of speech. We have a small U-shaped bone in our neck called the hyoid. It anchors the tongue and allows for the fine muscle movements needed for complex speech. A chimp's hyoid bone looks very different. For a long time, we didn't have a Neanderthal hyoid. Then one was found at a site called Kabara Cave in Israel. It was virtually identical to our own. The physical anatomy for speech was there. Then came the genetics. Scientists have been able to extract and sequence Neanderthal DNA from their bones. They looked for a gene called FOXP2. This gene is crucial for language development in humans. People with a mutated version of it have severe speech and language problems. The analysis showed that Neanderthals had the same version of the FOXP2 gene that we do. The anatomy was there. The genetics were there. It's almost certain they had language. It probably wasn't English or French, but it would have been a complex system of vocal communication far beyond simple grunts. They would have needed it to coordinate hunts for giant mammoths, to teach their children how to make complex tools, and to maintain their social bonds. So, if they were so smart, so capable, and so human, where did they go? This is one of the biggest mysteries in human evolution. Neanderthals dominated Europe and parts of Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. They were incredibly successful. Then around 40,000 years ago, they vanished from the fossil record. And it happens to be right around the time that my ancestors and yours, Homo sapiens, were spreading out of Africa and into their territory. For a long time, the story was a simple one of replacement. We, the smart, innovative Homo sapiens, showed up, and the dumb, brutish Neanderthals just couldn't compete. We wiped them out, either through violence or by just being better at getting food. It was a classic tale of evolutionary triumph. But the reality, like everything else about Neanderthals, is much more complicated and much more interesting. First, there was no lightning-fast conquest. Modern humans and Neanderthals coexisted in Europe for at least 5,000 years, maybe longer. That's a lot of time. That's more time than has passed between the building of the pyramids and today. They lived side by side, or at least in the same general regions. And they didn't just live side by side. They met, they interacted, and they had children together. This is perhaps the most profound discovery from the genetic research. When scientists compared the Neanderthal genome to the genomes of modern humans, they found a match. Every person today whose ancestry is from outside of sub-Saharan Africa has Neanderthal DNA in their genes. It's usually between 1 and 4%. It's a small amount, but it's there. Think about what that means. The Neanderthals never truly vanished. They were absorbed. A part of them lives on in us. Your immune system, your metabolism, your risk for certain diseases, all of these things are influenced by the fragments of Neanderthal DNA you carry. They are not some alien other. They are part of our family tree. They are ancestors. This fact, more than any other, demolishes the stereotype of the separate, inferior brute. You can't be a separate failed species if your genes are still walking around in billions of people today. So why did their distinct population disappear? There probably isn't one single answer. It was likely a combination of factors. The climate during that period was wildly unstable, swinging back and forth between cold and warm. This would have put immense pressure on animal and plant populations. Neanderthals lived in smaller, more isolated groups. Homo sapiens seem to have lived in larger groups with more extensive social networks. When times got tough, having a bigger network to fall back on would have been a huge advantage. If your local herd of reindeer disappears, you can get help or information from your cousins over the next mountain range. The Neanderthals may not have had that. There might have also been subtle advantages in technology. While Neanderthal tools were excellent, modern humans at the time were developing new things, like long-range projectile weapons such as spear throwers. Being able to hunt from a safer distance could have tipped the scales. Maybe we were just a bit more versatile in our diet. And it could simply be a story of numbers. If a larger, more connected population of Homo sapiens moved into the same territory as a smaller, more fragmented population of Neanderthals, over thousands of years the smaller group would simply be absorbed. Through interbreeding, their unique genetic signature would become diluted in the larger gene pool. It wasn't necessarily a violent conquest, it might have been a slow, quiet merger. They didn't lose the evolutionary race, they just became part of a new combined team. The story of the Brutish Caveman was never really about the evidence. It was a projection. It was a mirror reflecting the biases of the people who told it. They needed a primitive other to make themselves feel advanced and superior. They took an old man with arthritis and turned him into a monster. They ignored the complexity of the tools, the evidence of compassion, and the hints of culture because it didn't fit the simple, linear story they wanted to tell. The real story, the one backed by a century of patient and careful science, is so much better. It's a story of a different kind of humanity. Not a lesser kind, just a different one. Those Neanderthals were intelligent survivors, they were skilled engineers and powerful hunters. They took care of their sick and old, they buried their dead, they decorated their bodies and painted symbols on cave walls. They had families, they had language, they endured the crushing ice ages for hundreds of millennia. And in the end, they met us, they shared the landscape with us, and they shared their genes with us. The line between them and us is blurry, because a piece of them is in us. The Brutish Caveman is a fiction, he's a cartoon. The real Neanderthal was something far more profound, a human, in all the messy, complicated, and wonderful ways that matter. Looking at them is not like looking at an alien species. It's like looking at a long-lost cousin. And we're only just beginning to get to know them.